below where you can send your questions, or you can write it in the chat room. So we have two options. So you can use the question mark below where there is a Q&A and then submit your question, or you can use the chat room. Also, if you are able to use a headset, if you have a headset when you are speaking, also is better for a better quality of the voice, of course. And another thing, if you want to contribute, because the session is going to be interactive, if you want to contribute, you can ask to speak. When you are asking to speak, then we'll be able to open your mic, and then you will be able to contribute. So you are welcome, all of you, and glad to have you, every one of you. So let me first recognize our director, Dr. Andrew Mould, who is the head of ECA in Eastern Africa. And let me also ask him do you have a welcome remarks, sir? So please go ahead. You are still on mute, Andrew. So you need to unmute your microphone.
Good morning, Didier. Good morning, colleagues. Did you actually introduce yourself, did you? I'm not sure you did. I don't think you said who you were. I think that would be important to start.
Sorry.
No.
Yeah, my name is Didier Habimana. I work for ECA in Eastern Africa. So I'm the communications officer of the Office for Eastern Africa.
Okay, thank you, Didier. So welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for attending this second meeting in a series which started yesterday, our Intergovernmental Committee of Experts and Senior Officials meetings. Okay, it's called ICSOE. It's a very ugly acronym. But I think the content of what we're going to be discussing is very important. What we decided when we discussed these annual regional meetings, how to do it this year, was firstly, because of the budgetary situation, we decided to do these meetings online. And that has some inconveniences and drawbacks and also advantages. One of the advantages is, of course, we can invite a wider number of people than if we do this in person. And we decided to pick two themes in particular, which we felt for our member states were very crucial ones. One was the impact of disruption to global trade because of the new tariffs imposed by the US, and also just general disruption to global trading system. But the second theme, which is the theme of today, is actually about the impact of aid cutbacks to our member states in the region. And to discuss that, we've got a broad, I think, selection of people here from including government officials, including also representatives from private sector, from NGOs. I know many people have been impacted immediately and quite directly by some of these cutbacks. And although we talk a lot about the USAID winding down of their activities in the region, in actual fact, it's much broader than that. There are many countries currently cutting back on their aid allocations. So we wanted to have a session, an opportunity to discuss with our member states and our stakeholders the implications of this. There's a number of people, I believe, that are going to be joining online. We will welcome people individually as they join the discussion. But in the meantime, the background document that was prepared for this was prepared by my colleagues, Juanita and Elena, who are online. It's a draft at the moment, and we very much appreciate your feedback. And actually, we're going to use this session really to help enrich the analysis, so we have a much clearer picture of what the implications are of these cutbacks and what can be done by member states, by NGOs, and everybody else that's affected. Okay, so we're going to be giving a presentation where we go through some of the main points of the background document, and then we're going to open the floor for questions and conversation, which will be led and moderated by Didier. Okay, now one final thing. We want this to be as conversational as possible. So if anybody does have any burning questions, welcome, as Didier was explaining, to either put it in the chat box there, or if they really feel that there's a point that they want to come in on, raise their hand and we can possibly interrupt the presentation and give you the floor. Okay. So with that, I think we could probably proceed.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew. I think we can proceed also to let you know that we have also, for those who are French speaking, please, we have interpretation available. If you are speaking in French, please click on the button below for either French or English, depending on which language you prefer. So go ahead, Elena, do the first presentation. Thank you very much.
Perhaps just say good morning, maybe, Elena and Juanita.
Yes, yes.
So a
Good
few words.
morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, colleagues. Andrew will be starting off the presentation for us. Thank you.
Yes, I'm just going to set the scene a little bit for this presentation. So wanted to start actually referring to a paper that was recently published by the Overseas Development Institute, which talked to the vulnerability of low and middle income countries to the impacts of aid cuts and US tariff increases. Now, it's important to put, I think, the aid cutbacks in their proper perspective. And here, what the Overseas Development Institute tried to do was evaluate different kinds of risks and shock across these low income and middle income countries. And they did it by doing a kind of scorecard approach with different indicators for example, exposure to US tariffs. If a country exported a lot to the US market under AGOA, for example, it would be considered more vulnerable. If its economy was very integrated and open in trade terms, it would be implicated through spillovers from the global economy, the slowdown of the growth of the global economy. And resilience, it measured basically as an indicator of foreign exchange reserves, countries with large current account deficits, those kind of indicators to indicate a degree of general lack of resilience. And then finally, it was looking at aid cutbacks exposure. So this was basically the amount of aid cutbacks, how it would impact differentially on different countries. So yesterday, we actually did a presentation of this with our colleagues from Central Africa. And it was very noticeable. We took the data provided by ODA and we just looked at it for both Central and Eastern Africa. And we noticed very strongly that in their evaluation, the aid cutback exposure was far greater for Eastern Africa than it was for Central Africa. And for some countries, they deemed particularly in a situation of risk here, Somalia, South Sudan, countries such as Comoros, Rwanda, Central African Republic, and Burundi, a medium amount, then a lower in amount. But you can appreciate the other countries at the top of the list there were not deemed to be particularly exposed to the aid cutbacks. Now, to put this in context, in terms of tariff exposure to the US, actually only 4 countries in the 2 sub-regions were deemed to be vulnerable from that angle. The global spillovers, a number of countries in Central Africa were evaluated to be at risk. In our sub-region, it was Djibouti, clearly because of the trading situation and I think instability in the Red Sea and the way that disruption to the trade routes had caused some difficulties for Djibouti. And then finally, very pointedly, the report stressed the general lack of resilience as being the biggest factor of risk for member states across Central and Eastern Africa. Now, as I said, this reflects general indicators of risk such as current account deficits, which are very large, or lack of foreign exchange reserves. And it does suggest that all our member states, if they are to be more resilient to this kind of shock, they need to work on those kind of indicators. So putting that into context, I think it's important to stress that although we talked a lot about USAID cutbacks, in actual fact, this is coming across the board. So there are many other countries which have been announcing aid cutbacks. So the reduction in total for the US government, for example, in terms of its aid contributions, the largest OECD donor, as Elena is about to explain, compared with the 2023 level, the estimated reduction is a 56%. But we have a number of countries in the region which also receive quite a bit of assistance from the United Kingdom. And there you see a 40% reduction. In the case of Germany, 23%. In the case of France, 20%. Canada, 21%. Sweden, 25%. The Netherlands, 18%. Only 2 countries amongst the OECD DAC countries where data was available for these projections was their increases. And these, well, Japan is one of the larger donors. Okay, so this is more significant. Italy is one of the smaller group of donors, but still significant. So in actual fact, we see a very broad cutback in development assistance. And Elena will take us through some of the statistics in a minute, so we realize how much. This can have a real impact on some of our member states. So one analysis was showing the dependence of spending in the health sector, for example, in different countries. And again, we'll come back on these statistics. You could see that for Tanzania, 86% of health spending support from the donor community came from the United States alone. In the case of governance for Tanzania, the EU was the major partner. And there also the European Union, which is considered a multilateral, not a bilateral donor, of course, was also undergoing quite significant cutbacks to its development assistance. And then finally, in education, you can see that for Tanzania, at least, the share of partners contributing to the education budget is a little bit more diversified. But given the fact that all those countries there, with the exception of Korea, are the ones that are announcing major cutbacks, you can appreciate that they will be impacted. So we're going to take you through some of the details in this session now, just to explain what the broad implications are for our member states. But we would also very much like to hear from representatives of the civil society as well. And I think what makes this issue is all the more crucial is the fact that a lot of our member states are currently in quite a difficult fiscal situation. So the chart that we see on the slide here basically plots the level of government debt to fiscal deficits. Now, if you know about the World Bank IMF criteria about levels of debt, they deem that for developing countries, generally above 55% is not advisable. And when it gets up to 70%, countries can face quite serious challenges. In our region, we have a number of countries which are close to the 70% mark, and also with quite large fiscal deficits, so notably Rwanda, Uganda, and Kenya. Now, there is a difference between some of these countries, the economic implications of it, because, for example, whereas Rwanda has a lot of concessional debt and thus pays relatively lower interest rates on that amount of debt, Kenya does not. And I believe we have representatives from State Department of Economic Planning. I believe it's Elizabeth Wayua is present, and I believe we also have another representative, Judith Onyango, as well. Perhaps they'd like to come in on this point in a minute. So I think it is important to stress there is a differential impact on our member states, depending on the cost of that debt. The good news is from the IMF projections we've seen for 2025, most of the countries will see a small tapering off of that debt burden this year. Okay, so the fiscal deficits will be reduced to some extent across the board for member states in Eastern Africa. The bad news is it's a relatively marginal amount. We're talking about equivalent of from 0.2 to 0.6% of GDP. And one other factor that is playing in favor of our member states is actually the quite sharp depreciation of the US dollar that we've seen since the beginning of this year. which is depreciate, is it by about 11 or 12%. And this is important because a lot of the debt of the Eastern Africa region is denominated in US dollars. So in the case of Tanzania, for example, about 60% of its external debt is US dollar denominated debt. So the devaluation of the dollar does make it a little bit less painful for our member states to manage these fiscal situation. But we just wanted to stress this one point, that the cutbacks in overseas development assistance do not come at a good time for our member states. It comes at a time when they're quite fiscally challenged in the first place. And so with that, I'd like to pass the floor to our colleague Elena, who's going to give you an overview of this shifting global and donor context. Elena, over to you, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Director. As Andrew mentioned, now that we've looked at why these aid cutbacks matter to Eastern Africa, we'll now be looking at more details on the global and donor context and how this will affect our countries. So to start off, as we can see here, official development assistance to Africa has been on a very clear downward trend since 2020. After peaking during the pandemic at just over $80 billion, flows have been steadily trended downwards, reaching 68.2 billion in 2023. In 2024, net ODA dropped a further 9%, and it is projected that there will be an even larger contraction of between 9 and 17% in 2025. For additional context, if we look at a longer term view, ODA from DAP countries in specific to Eastern Africa rose sharply since 2004 until after 2008 financial crisis, and then it peaked in 2011. But since then, the flows have been relatively level, and in recent years they have been more stabilized, and this shows just how aid to the region has plateaued rather than continued growing. Here we will see just how concentrated Africa's bilateral aid flows are. So in 2023, we can see that the US alone provided over $14 billion of ODA, while France and Germany contributed around $4 billion each. And together, these accounted for more than 2/3 of all bilateral ODA to Africa from those top 10 providers. So what we see is that this heavy reliance on just a few donors means that when they scale back, as Andrew had mentioned, the impact on African countries is significant, especially for those where one donor country dominates critical sectors such as health and education. Looking at the regional picture, this is particularly worrying because Eastern Africa continues to receive the largest share of Africa's aid flows. And in specific, in 2023, the subregion received $30.1 billion US dollars, which represented 44% of the continent's total. And if we look at how this assistance is distributed within our Eastern African region, we can see that the distribution is quite uneven as well. Ethiopia and DRC stand out as they are the biggest recipients, reflecting both their population size as well as some of their development needs. Tanzania, Kenya also feature quite prominently on here, while we see countries such as Djibouti and Comoros and Eritrea receiving more modest amounts. In this chart, we have calculated the ODA per capita data and grouped the Eastern African countries into about 3 categories: those that are highly aid dependent, those in the middle range, and those with relatively low dependence. What we see is that even though the smaller states such as Djibouti, Comoros receive larger aid flows in absolute terms, they receive much less in absolute terms. In per capita terms, they appear to be more aid dependent. And then by contrast, we see some larger economies like Kenya, Ethiopia, DRC receiving big volumes in absolute terms, but they fall into this medium dependence groups. At the other end of the spectrum, we have Eritrea, which sits in the least aid developed dependent category. And to provide some further context on this is likely due to the express policy by the government of Eritrea to actually reduce its dependence on foreign aid and rely more on domestic mobilization instead. In this chart, we'll see an answer to an important question, which is really how much of the ODA that countries receive is actually disposable for the recipient governments. And so to answer this, the OECD calculates what is called the country programmable aid. And essentially, this is the portion of the aid that the government can realistically plan around, if I can say. And to arrive at this figure, they strip out elements of ODA received, such as humanitarian assistance, debt relief, donors' administrative costs, refugee costs, or core fundings to NGOs, just to name a few. And what remains from that aid is what the governments can actually integrate into their budgets and use for more long-term development planning. And as you can see here, the difference in some of these countries is quite striking. In countries like Ethiopia, DRC, and Somalia, South Sudan, the programmable portion is far lower than the headline ODA figures would suggest. So for example, in Ethiopia, from the total aid received in 2023, 3.9 million of that was country programmable aid. And then the rest, 1.5, was what we call non-programmable aid.
I should clarify, Elena, this
yes?
is billion, actually. These are billions.
It's billion. Okay,
Yes.
apologies.
Yep.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And so what this underlines is that the real resources available for development are often more limited or just less than the official numbers imply. So here we see another layer of some form of vulnerability, which is really the high concentration of aid among just a few providers in some of the countries in our regions. In Burundi, we can see that nearly 3/4 of the aid comes from the International Development Association, the US, and the EU. Madagascar's profile is similar, dominated by the IDA in the United States. If we look at the DRC, the United States alone provides almost half of all its external assistance, while IDA and a few multilateral funds make up much more of that, the rest of that. In South Sudan, support relies heavily on the United States and IDA, and that's also supplemented by EU institutions, Germany and Canada. Now, seeing that US assistance makes up a large share of ODA in a number of our countries, we can see that in this table, we can see the varied impact of US aid across the region. So these are provisional figures that were retrieved from the Center of Global Development earlier this year. And if we look at the last column, which shows the cuts of US aid in absolute terms, we can note that the DRC, Ethiopia, each face reductions of close to $400 million, making them essentially the hardest hit. Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania also see quite large losses ranging between $200 and $300 million each. By contrast, the smaller states like Djibouti or Comoros experienced almost a total elimination of their US programs. But in absolute terms, the amounts are much smaller. So I would say that the picture is somewhat twofold. The larger countries face biggest losses in absolute terms, while the smaller countries feel the cuts more acutely because their dependence is higher. Later in this presentation, we'll look at some more recent figures on this. So now that we've looked at the scale of aid reductions and which countries are more exposed, the next question is, so which sectors are at greatest risk? This is important because the cutbacks, as we've mentioned before, don't affect all areas equally, and some sectors are more dependent on external financing than others. Here we will see how dramatic the decline in US assistance has been. And just to note, this is based on US foreign assistance obligations, and the actual committed numbers may look a little different. As you may be aware, earlier this year, the US administration issued an executive order to freeze assistance for 90 days in order to review their funding priorities. So in 2024, US foreign aid was heavily concentrated in peace and security, humanitarian assistance, and health, with significant allocations across the other multiple sectors. But by 2025, the picture changes. Peace and security, once it was nearly at $30 billion in 2024, has been reduced quite dramatically. Health also falls from over 13 billion to just over 4 billion. Humanitarian assistance and education have also reduced. And what we see here is not really just the reduction in overall volumes, but also the fundamental reshaping of the US priorities. To go a little bit more in detail on this specific US foreign assistance, what I'm showing here are excerpts from the US government foreign assistance dashboard, which ranks obligations by country and by sectors by the US government. And I will just share a case of a few Eastern African countries that have historically received large volumes of US support. So starting with Ethiopia, as we can see, the obligations have fallen dramatically from $1.5 billion in 2023 to just $470 million in 2025. And in terms of sectors, the most striking cut is in humanitarian assistance, which drops from nearly $1 billion to just a fraction of that. Health and economic development are also scaled back quite sharply. In Somalia, the obligations from the US government declined from 1.2 billion in 2023 to just 150 million in 2025. And for the sectors, we can see that humanitarian assistance that was once over 800 million is reduced to just over 100 million. And health actually is almost eliminated or close to. In South Sudan, we see obligations shrinking from 740 million in 2023 to only 52 million in 2025. And if we look at the sectors, humanitarian aid alone falls from more than $500 million to under 10 million. So now, if we can recall Andrew's opening slide, he highlighted both the scale of the cutbacks from donors, with the US reducing over 50%, if I remember correctly, and the United Kingdom by 40%. And he also gave us the example of Tanzania. And here we can see two more examples, Ethiopia and DRC. So in Ethiopia, nearly 60% of health ODA from its top 5 providers comes from the United States. And government funding is also largely provided by EU or EU institutions. And the education also relies or depends heavily on UK and Germany in terms of aid flows. In DRC, the pattern is somewhat similar. The US accounts for almost 60% of health support, while with governance and education, it's concentrated among the EU, France, and Belgium. So when you map those planned cutbacks from the data we saw earlier onto this picture, you can see how vulnerable these sectors could be or are. I also have here the example of Somalia and South Sudan. So what we see in Somalia is that in terms of bilateral aid from the top 5 providers, the health sector is divided between the United States, Switzerland, and the UK. For governance, aid relies mostly on the EU, while education also receives almost all its aid from the EU and a handful of bilateral donors. For South Sudan, again, the US provides almost 40% of health ODA, while governance funding is concentrated among EU, Norway, the Netherlands, Germany. And then finally, in education, again, it rests with a handful of just a few donors, though it's a little bit more balanced in terms of the top 5 providers. So again, if we recall back to the figures, it was France cutting back around 20%, Germany by around 23%, Canada by 21%, alongside the US reduction of almost more than half. So we can appreciate that these countries become particularly more exposed. So with that, I will hand over to my colleague Honita to take us through the next section.
Thank you, Elena. So as Elena described the situation right now against the cutbacks from the DAC donors, mainly, we're going to speak about now what is the alternative that probably, in terms of partners of development that we can look at. Obviously, the discourse is generally that we look towards the South. What is the potential collaboration and partnership towards the South for development purposes of the region? And the obvious two names of the countries that come up often in the context of Africa and especially in the context of East Africa, although we do have actors from the Gulf region, which are also very active in the sub-region, but it's mostly China and India which stand prominently in terms of their presence in different sectors of the economy. So for example, if we take China, so China's global foreign aid expenditure, if we look at the trend, it started off quite timidly in the 2000s, and then it dropped at a certain point in 2016, which is when the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative was conceptualized by the Chinese government, after which in 2024, we see that it has peaked to 3.46 billion, which is quite substantial. And the trend in terms of China's global foreign aid is actually really mapped according to the interventions of the FOCAC, which occur every 3 years. So after every 3 years, you get an envelope which is voted by for the African continent, really, in terms of the projects that are going to be supported. So, but in terms of the region, the sub-region, the Eastern African sub-region, when we look at the data, we see that China's intervention, obviously, in Africa is not really well, it's not uniform. So there are certain countries which receive more, and these are strategic interventions, really. We see in 2021, we see Ethiopia and Kenya as being the prominent receiving countries from China. And these are mostly in the areas of infrastructure, in terms of health, in terms of road utilities. So these, the model that China has been using, we can't really compare it to the donor model of DAC, the partnership model of DAC. Really, what they do is it's mostly channeled through the China Exim Bank or the Sino Hydro Corporations, which is the state-owned companies. And it's mostly in the format of concessional loans rather than grants. And similarly, in fact, we have elaborated in the paper that is shared in the chat, the full-fledged paper, the intervention of India is similarly mapped. For example, in India, it's also channeled through the Exim Bank of India, and there are certain countries which are more at the receiving end of these foreign aids as compared to the general overall continent. So there are areas that India is most, sorry for the noise. So the area where India is mostly active in is more in terms of technical assistance, capacity building. So a large component of the Indian support to East Africa and the rest of Africa is largely also grants in areas of soft support, such as trainings and capacity building, and concessional loans and lines of credits in areas of infrastructure, education, and health. And the figures actually, the challenge that we have in mapping India's intervention is actually it's mapped over a large period of time. So the plan is for spending over 10 years, foreign aid over 10 years. So it's very difficult to actually put a finger on what actual is the comparative data for the region for a specific period of time. Overall, when we look at these trends and we compare it to what DAC countries have been giving to the region, to Africa and to the region. So In 2023, as Elena had mentioned, so DAC ODA to Africa has been 35.9 billion. Comparatively, China, of which Eastern Africa benefited a third. But compared to that, when we looked at the Chinese aid to Eastern Africa, it was very minimal in the millions. So 685 million to Eastern Africa during the same period. As for India, we have not a definite time frame for which the money that was injected in development aid towards Africa expands over, but it was a commitment in 2023 for the Indian government to give 12.3 billion towards Africa in general, not specifically to East Africa. So therefore, it really, the comparison really does not allow us to think of the non-DAC partners as being making up for the gap that the DAC countries are leaving with the cutbacks. Because firstly, the amounts are not really matchable. The structures are different. DAC countries would traditionally also provide a lot of grants, but non-DAC countries mainly extend concessional loans, lines of credit to African countries, which also add a bit to the debt burden, really. And also the areas of intervention we have mentioned, Elena talked about how health, education were impacted with the cutbacks from the traditional donors. But really, the non-DAC countries do not play in the same field. Therefore, their intervention is more on technical assistance, the capacity building, the infrastructure. So it really does not make up for the gap that is being left. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Andrew actually for the conclusion and sum up. Thank you.
Yes, so I wanted to just clarify a couple of things. So firstly, apologies to everybody for so many numbers. We're economists, so we talk in tables and graphs, I'm afraid. I hope that was digestible. One thing we didn't explain at the very beginning was the definition of the OECD DAC. To those who are not familiar, this is the Development Aid Committee of the OECD, based in Paris. And this basically is the club of donors which abide by Development Aid Committee rules. Now, I used to work at the OECD Development Center, which was a sister organization. I used to attend the DAC meetings. And they set down a certain standards in terms of how aid is accounted for. Now, Honita's just presented the cases of India and China. They are not DAC members, and so they are not counted as OECD Development Aid Committee members. And China is an observer to the OECD DAC, so they do attend the meetings, but they do not abide by the same set of rules about what is considered overseas development assistance or not. So yeah, just to clarify that, because we talked about the DAC a lot, didn't we? And I didn't think everybody may necessarily be aware. Okay, colleagues, there's still some attendees, government officials and representatives from civil society we wish to speak. Please promote them, please. I'm not seeing them in the panelists list yet. So by way of conclusion, to sum up some of the points, I think we see very clearly, at least from the USAID cutbacks, that the health sector and education are going to be very hit. Governance also seems to be quite affected, although we saw that European Union support was more important in that area. Peace and security and humanitarian assistance is clearly going to be affected. And there's a lot of concern about funding for refugee programs, for example. And I know a number of NGOs in the region have closed down or very much reduced their operations because of USAID cutbacks. I'm also aware that in some countries, it's certain parts of the countries impacted more by these cutbacks than in other parts. So I was reading reports about in Kisumu and the area around that, quite heavily dependent on USAID support. A lot of those programs are cut back. So this is one of the things we'd like to talk to you about. I think we can also appreciate that some support in the area of agriculture and food security initiatives they're going to feel the impact of some of these cutbacks. And very crucially for the US, of course, they're not funding any longer any climate related activities. So that's another area. So these are some tentative conclusions, but really, ladies and gentlemen, we wish to flesh the conclusions out with you and to hear from you about what you think about the situation is going to be going forward and what actions can be taken. So one discussion that is quite widespread is about re-energizing development financial institutions like the African Development Bank's funding, the East African Development Bank, institutions like the Afrin-Exim Bank, also to leverage more some of the emerging donors and the private sector. How can we engage with them to increase financial resources from these sources? A second point that we raise in the background paper is about the importance of scaling up programs that have worked especially well. So there's a number of safety net programs, for example, across the region, which I think in general, it's fair to say the assessments have been broadly quite positive. These kind of cash transfer programs to help particularly vulnerable communities or the unemployed or the underemployed. So those kind of programs are worthy of support. And our final observation here really is about the importance of strengthening fiscal systems in this time of quite difficult financial situation for our member states, implement measures to increase domestic savings. Domestic savings continue to be low for most of our countries. There's a couple of countries which stand out in contrast to this, but in general, savings rates are very low. And this is one consequence of this is interest rates are high, and there's this tremendous dependence on external financing. That is not a sustainable way for long-term development. So I think some discussion about domestic savings would be important and mobilize more domestic revenues where feasible. Okay, so those are some of to sum up. And so just to go through the main points this presentation has made. So ODA cutbacks are pretty steep. It's already fallen by about 10% last year. We're expecting 17% globally, but as you could see from some of the figures from individual donors, it could be higher in some circumstances. And the USA donors, the DAC, the non-DAC donors, is that it's important in context, but it is insufficient really to step into the breach filled by some of those traditional donors at the current juncture. A third point is effectively we face quite a challenging fiscal situation, and so the ODA cutbacks couldn't really have come at a worse time. And our final point is governments can use this as a moment to reassess their spending effectiveness and accelerate reforms that strengthen their own economic resilience. And I think that's possibly the key message to take home from all of this. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for listening. As I said, I hope we didn't bombard you with too many numbers and statistics, but we most welcome your interventions from the floor. And I see there's one hand up already. I was wondering actually, Didier, before we open the floor to everybody, I can see that we have Hassan Hassal, who's an advisor to the president of Somalia and heads the National Economic Council of Somalia. I think because we were singling out Somalia, particularly there for some of the numbers in terms of the US aid cutbacks and US support. I was wondering if we could invite Hassan to say a first few words and then open the floor to others. Hassan, would that be feasible?
Sure, we can open the floor to Hassan. You can unmute and give us your contribution. We also have the chargé de mission, the officer in charge, Mr. Raj Mohabir of the Indian Ocean Commission, who would like also to speak. after Hassan, we can give the floor to Mr. Mohabir.
Yes. I see we also have Didier, Mr. Muksini Mukumba who's economist from the Ministry of Finance in Tanzania. It would be very interesting to hear from them as well.
Sure. So we can have the floor statements. I mean the three statements. So
now Hassan isn't currently, he's an attendee. I've been asking for the promotion of people to panelists, please, but that's not happened, I'm afraid. So I'm not sure if Hassan can speak. While we fix that, perhaps one of the other people,
yes.
Mr. Raj, could intervene.
Yes.
Yes, thanks very much, everyone. I'm sorry, I'll go directly to the points I wanted to make. I think, first of all, I would like to really welcome this exchange. It is really important and crucial, not just because one of the major or most important player in terms of ODA has decided to substantially reduce or even eliminate development aid, but for many other reasons. So I really would implore, not to say make a pledge, but implore UNECA to take up this as a very important issue, to be as a permanent theme for discussions all across Africa, and hence to maybe get a sort of a series of webinars and even some regional or Pan-African workshops on these. So it should be a permanent process for all of us, as it has been very well presented in the various presentations, that the ODA for most of the African countries, whether in terms of amount or in terms of the percentage of its importance in the country's development process, is key. So I think that it is very important. So for my first pledge would be to UNECA to take this as an important permanent focus and theme to be discussed and engage with countries. Now, my second point is that I take this as an opportunity to make some critical assessments of ODA, and I would urge that beyond the presentations what are done in terms of what is the situation of ODA, to go much beyond the issue and raise and study other points. First, in the past, ODA was much more beneficiary development focused tool. Now I see that their focus has practically changed. Whichever country or institution may be a development partner, from the focus from a development for the beneficiary towards, I would presume, more a shared interest focus. And I think it's very important for us to try to understand that what is happening. I won't go that far as saying that now we are shifting from the development focus of the beneficiary to where the interest of the institution of the country providing assistance is looking at its own interest. I think it's very important, this kind of, and that's why I'm imploring UNECA to take up this challenge, because I believe that though there are many things that have been spoken in sidelines of meetings, but I believe that there are many things related to this issue of how far it is the development of the beneficiary, how far it is promoting shared interest, and how far it is practically imposing the interest of the one who's paying and having a paymaster approach rather. I think it's important that there is an independent player looking at these things. My second suggestion on the permanent focus, as I said, which should be, is the issue of the effectiveness of the ODA. I'm telling you, I have been in this ODA business for the last 30 years, 3 decades. I've been working at the IOC for 26 years. And before that, I was working in the Ministry of Economic Planning of Mauritius. And here I'm touching on something I believe which is sensitive, and I know that country representative may not like it, but I think it's important to know. You know, if you look at and you analyze the budget and the budgetary processes of our countries, what do you see? That is focused on salaries of officials, and that's all. And this is where the issue of the challenges, for example, a country transiting from one state to the other, like for example Mauritius. I still remember in the late 90s when there was a decision taken saying, okay, the UNICEF office should be closed because, and this is, I'm quoting, the decision was taken because the amount of funding that UNICEF is bringing is less than the amount which is costing for hosting UNICEF office in Mauritius. But if you look at what has happened to Mauritius, that there have been a shift, a change, a transition of the family, the whole society is changing. The issue of the youth, getting on their own, all the women are now working, all the challenges for the youth and many of the challenges for the child. When you analyze it, I would have expected that at that time, there would have been someone looking at saying, hey, don't look at the amount of funding, look at what UNICEF is bringing. And Mauritius is in the context of a transition, a demographic transition. And just for you, maybe you know that since 2018, I think the population of Mauritius has stopped growing. It is in fact a population which is decreasing. So at that time, someone should have said to Mauritius, no, don't do that, because the UNICEF would have been a mechanism for understanding what is happening to the transition or in other countries. And then we can understand from the other countries, and UNICEF should help us to reorient our policies with respect to the child, to the status of women, to the institution of families, etc. So my second most important issue for a permanent focus should be the effectiveness of ODA, and linked to it is the whole budgetary and financial system in the countries. Why innovative financing has not taken off. Now, the other issue...
Raj?
Yep.
To keep this as conversational as possible, I think you've had some wonderful insights there, and I think those are 2 very important take-homes. But could we come back to you in a minute, because I think we need to talk more on these particular topics.
Okay, can you just let me finish just 30 seconds?
Sure.
Because the other issue of ODA is fungibility. Because, for example, at regional level, we don't build roads or buildings. We change the way people are working together. So there is this issue of not already fixing what you will do in 3 years, 4 years. My last point for a permanent focus on this matter would be how far the NGOs or other actors, including those who are vulnerable groups, how far they are impacted negatively by this change of policy at regional level or international level regarding the ODA. So maybe I stop here. I had a long list of other issues, but I was not aware of whether I could speak lengthily or not. So I'll chip in.
No,
Thank you very much. Sorry. Sorry.
You actually set the scene for the conversation very, very well, actually. So we'd like to come back to you on some of those points. And I think your points about the efficiency of aid were very well taken. That's precisely why we showed the figures on country programmable aid, for example, which is an effort of the DAC at least to look at the amount which is at least at the disposition of the recipient country, rather than, as you were saying, a lot of this goes on salaries, which is not necessarily staying within the country at all in the first place. So those quality issues are very fundamental. Let's come back on those points. I'd now like to just invite our distinguished colleague Hassan Hazal to say a few words, because Somalia, as we saw from the stats, and I don't know whether, Elena, you could come back to the actual slide where we had the Somali figures there. But Hassan, if you could give us some insights about what's going on currently in Somalia in terms of dealing with the aid cutbacks and how it will be impacting and what measures the government are taking, we'd love to hear from you about that.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for the ECA team. The presentations were really very good. We have been looking into this issue for a while right now, since the US government announced it back in January. If we look just at the numbers,
okay. Sorry, I was just telling my colleague actually not to put it up, so we were listening to you. But no, yes, it's a good idea, isn't it? Yes, to illustrate it.
So, Somalia has been aid dependent for a long time. Aid forms 30% of our GDP, but we are recovering, and it is diminishing bit by bit as recovery continues. We receive aid from different sources. With regards to the US government, it was through the USAID that funded mostly humanitarian operations, but also from the State Department that funded some of our security and governance aspects. When the US government announced the freeze and aid cuts, we did some analysis on how it would affect the economy. What we found out was a bit mixed picture. Number one, the US government through the USAID funded 50%, almost 50% of our humanitarian operations in the country. So overall, aid to Somalia was estimated around $2 billion every year. 1 billion of that used to go to humanitarian aid, and half of that is funded by the US government. But the US government, the aid to Somalia does not go through the Somali country systems. So it goes through NGOs, it goes through the UN agencies in the country. They channel it through other agencies, but not through the government budget, not through the Central Bank of Somalia, unlike the World Bank. And it was mostly humanitarian. So what happens is, when we looked at the data, as you also showed in your presentation, aid to Somalia in 2023 was about $1 billion, but in 2024 it was half of that, like 500 million. That difference in aid is equal to what we expect now from 2024 to 2025. So from 2024 to 2025, it is around 400, but from 2023 to 2024 was also similar amount. That did not translate into economic shock that had transmission into the overall economy. The one in 2024 2024. But the reduction in 2025, we talked to the World Bank, to the IMF, we talked to the private sector. This time, we're looking at this cuts as if they are more severe than the previous one, even though the numbers are the same. Now, what we estimate the impact to be is around $400 to $500 million this year. That would affect our growth rate by 1%, from 4% to 3%. It will affect our revenue collection by 14%. It will also affect other areas, but those other areas, really, we can't quantify them because we don't have the actual numbers. The actual numbers were not through the government systems. They were through the NGOs, and it was really very difficult to get data. But we hope that through other mechanisms, whether it is increase in budget support from the World Bank or repurposing some of the World Bank projects, we would be able to meet some of those challenges. Not entirely, but I think we would able to rework that. There are some programs in the country that have been deemed essential, and the US government actually gave them exemptions. And we hope that we requested for a review, and we hope that that review brings in some changes to the current status quo. But on the grand scheme of things, we will, this aid cuts, it is a big issue for us, but it's also an opportunity for us to rework our system, to improve our fiduciary risks, to engage bilaterally with the US government to see if the aid could be, if whatever aid comes from could be channeled through the use of country systems. But so far, we are, those are the actual implications that we are thinking, but it was very, data is not readily available on all sectors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hassan. So did I understand correctly, you were saying that you lost about 500 million last year in 2024, but that didn't have much of an impact on the economy at the time?
Yes, on revenue, on economic growth rate, if I could explain that a bit, yes, in absolute numbers, that was the number, but that spike in aid, around over 1 billion, was a response to a near famine situation in the country. So when that famine situation was averted and the agricultural production really improved, maybe that bridged the gap, and it did not translate into the cuts in 2024 did not translate into economic shock. So maybe that got bridged by agricultural production.
Okay, thank you for that explanation, Hassan. That's good to hear. Lena, I think you can stop sharing the screen now. Do we have anybody else from the floor that wish to speak? Didier, could you assist in inviting the next person? Didier, you do need to unmute as well.
Sorry. Yes. We had Madame Musonda who wanted to contribute as well. Madame, so you have the floor.
You introduce yourself, please, Madame Musonda.
Thanks very much. Yeah, my name is Jo Musonda. I'm the country director for Save the Children in Rwanda and Burundi.
Welcome.
So I know my colleague is just going to share a couple of slides, and we can go straight to 3 and 4. It's fine if you can make them full screen, please. Yeah, I mean, maybe just to give a bigger picture, I think like all NGOs, whether you're INGOs or local NGOs, we've all been affected by the budget cuts, by the reduction in ODA. not just from the states. Obviously, the way in which that was done was very sudden, unexpected, and quite frankly chaotic, I think. But there, we felt the cuts from other governments as well. And that's really affected our programming. I'm going to concentrate on the effect on children because, as Save the Children, that's really our remit, because we're really focused on survival, learning, and protection of children, as well as children's participation. I don't know if you can make that full screen. It looks slightly odd at the moment. If you can go up to the previous slide, that will be fine. Anyway, in the meantime, really the point I wanted to make, well, there's a couple of things. Certainly with regard to the bigger picture, Save the Children in Rwanda and Burundi. In Rwanda, we're about half and half humanitarian response and half development. In Burundi, it's far more on the humanitarian response. And really, the budget, essentially we lost about a third of our funding, put it that way, and over a third of our staff. We can go to the next slide. And then really, I think we all know Africa has the youngest population on the planet, and I can't overstate the effect on children. So it's fine, myself. The impacts on children are massive. It's affecting children's health, their very survival. We've made so many gains over the years in terms of improvement in neonatal child health, maternal health. So it affects those programs, it affects nutrition programs, and it's reduced our ability to support community health workers and get early detection and treatment of childhood illnesses. So we're going to see a lot of, and we won't see it immediately, but we anticipate seeing gains that we've made in those areas going the wrong way. We've lost some of our programming, not all of it, particularly focusing on early childhood development. We know that the bigger investment that you have on preschool, on early childhood development, it helps children's cognitive ability, and it basically sets them up for life. If you can focus on the early years, you're going to have the biggest, if you like, return on investment for improving those children's lives, but also making them full kind of citizens, contributing to the wealth and of their families, the country, etc. So really, cutting those programs is going to have a big effect across the continent. With regard to child protection and mental health services, I mean, already the child protection systems are quite fragile. And we know that we're going to see an increase in abuse, in trafficking, teenage pregnancy and exploitation. I mean, trafficking is really increasing and is part of the, if you like, the new world order. And we know that those systems, but in particular, some of the communication that we got was around, okay, we can keep life-saving treatment. And so then we had to dig down into what do we mean by life-saving? And unfortunately, in many cases, prevention of gender-based violence and child protection was not classed as life-saving. I would argue that point. But we can see that some services that we have managed to retain have been focused on health, health and nutrition. But unfortunately, child protection is really, really underfunded. And, we're going to see a lot more problems in that area. As we've said already, I mean, Africa is a very young population, and the East Africa is no exception to that. So again, this whole thing around migration and, being a global issue, if there's no investment in young people, not only in children, but young people to be able to learn a skill, be able to be financially viable for themselves and their families, we're going to see more migration. So all of those sectors are going to be already being deeply affected, and there's far less services, whether it's sexual reproductive health services or entrepreneurship, etc., for the empowerment of youth in our society. You can go to the next slide. There's also a very much a shrinking space for civil society that we're seeing in many countries, which is very worrisome. Let me move on to kind of what we're doing as an organization. to address this. And really, I just wanted to make the point, Save the Children is over 100 years old, but we know that we cannot continue to deliver aid in the way that it was done 100 years ago. The world has changed, and we have shifted in response to this. And we were already in the process of shifting, but I think it's really accelerated this process. Essentially, you're never going to get impact at scale unless you work with the most important local partner, which is always the government. And really, NGOs should not be there to gap fill, but really supporting the government to lead locally owned solutions. And that's what we're working on at the moment. One example, we have a program where we're working with the Ministry of Education to bring children back to school and retain them in school, because we know that a solid education is really setting people up to a life of prosperity. One thing that we are doing quite differently, we've been doing this for a while now, for a number of years, is really around innovative financing. And we are getting impact investors in to support small businesses who have businesses who are supporting children, whether it's around running early childhood development centres, nurse-led clinics, whether it's to help in children's nutrition, in all of those areas. And that's through our innovation hub called Kumwe Hub. And we're really looking to expand that and attract more investors so we can expand that not only in Rwanda, but throughout the continent. We're looking increasingly at results-based programming, because again, impact investors are looking for that, what is the impact? And we need to get much better. And I think we have improved, but I think across the sector, all of us need to get much better at our evidence and making sure we're doing programs that are effective and drop those things, that business as usual approach for how we used to do things. In addition, we have always, and we continue to partner with and help deliver organisational capacity building of local civil society actors. And we have different roles to play in that. I think there's some things that really it needs to be the local civil society, but they're small. They are underfunded, they are under-resourced, and we need to help them in their systems so that they are able to hold their own governments to account for delivering services for their citizens. And increasingly, we hear this term around shifting the power, but really it is about giving communities and children, really putting them in the driving seat as to how aid needs to happen and happen most effectively. Because, sometimes in the past, aid has really been driven by donor priorities rather than what the local community thinks it needs. So I think those are all things that we're doing to improve the situation. But I cannot underplay how badly it's affected our sector. It's been a very, very challenging year. However, sometimes when something so disruptive happens, it is the mother of invention, it's the mother of innovation. And I think that's really what we're leaning into at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention, Jo. I wanted to ask you a question, which I hope it's not too delicate.
Okay.
But what is the Save the Children's funding, Save the Children's prime donors? Who are you dependent on? And so where have the cutbacks been heaviest? Because you didn't actually talk about the figures and statistics. You talked about, the operational side of it, but
yeah. Are you talking about in Rwanda and Burundi or globally?
Well, in the region, if you have knowledge of the funding for the other offices, but you could speak specifically of Rwanda and Burundi as well, if that's the one under your responsibility.
I mean, I'll be honest with you, I don't have at my fingertips the actual statistics to give you, and I could probably find those out because we're really quite varied in our funding. Mm-hmm. But let's just say, certainly the US government has been very significant, both globally and regionally. I used to have this saying, which I feel is coming to bite me now. I used to say, and I think it's very true, nobody gives multi-million-dollar, multi-year awards like the US government. And I think we all knew that, these big 5-year, several $million awards were quite rare to get from other donors, not completely unheard of, but, the extent of that. So I can't underplay the effect of the US government stop work order in particular. We have varied funding. I mean, you name it, it's there. So from the EU, from all the European governments, from philanthropists, private donors, it will depend from one country to another. Certainly in the region, we have been very, very badly affected. I mean, you talked about some countries, like, I mean, I know Tanzania has been very badly affected, even Somalia. And again, I'd have to dig down into the absolute figures versus the percentage, because that will really vary from one place to another. Yeah, so I think it's fair to say, I mean, we've seen this kind of wave of nationalism going on across the world, and that has definitely reduced, countries' ODA. I mean, many of them, even countries that, in the past you would be surprised that they are reducing their ODA, like someone like Sweden, for example. So we've had other donors who have not pulled out in the way that the stop work order affected American ODA, but perhaps programs that they are expecting to run, or they're expecting to run with so many different countries, they're either not running them now or they've had to reduce. So yeah, I mean, I'm going to have to get back to you about those specifics, because I wasn't asked to kind of.
I can imagine there's a degree of confidentiality in it anyway. But I was just asking, basically, to have an idea of, because from what you're saying, you do have quite a wide portfolio of supporters, but you are seeing the same picture across all of them. It's not just the USAID cutbacks, but it is also, as you were saying, Sweden, for example, United Kingdom. Other donors as well. So yeah, that hasn't happened before, I don't think, has it? Such a generalized cutback.
You're right, and I think for us, I mean, education. We're worried now about the education, because, in particular, excuse me, the British government has been a big supporter of education. I mean, your statistics that you showed illustrated that point, that they've been a very large contributor, in particular, to education in many different countries. Sweden, for us, was more of a large contributor in the governance space. The Americans have dominated health in the region, not just with PEPFAR, but way beyond that. So yeah, I mean, it's really, really been across the board, and everybody has seen reductions. And I think we've already seen some NGOs go to the wall, and we're going to see more, that's for sure. And other ones perhaps combining or rationalizing what they are doing and how they're delivering it. The UN systems, I mean, there's going to have to be change in the UN systems, because they can't continue in the way that they are. They can't. They absolutely.
Well, yes, okay. We can get into that conversation about the UN in a minute, because that's one, of course, that we're acutely aware of at the Economic Commission for Africa. But thank you very much for those insights, Joe. Didier, I don't know if we could invite for the floor another civil society or NGO. That would be useful to hear from them, and then government as well. Yes, I mean, we've been talking quite a bit about the fiscal situations in countries such as Kenya, for example. I believe 2 Kenyan officials were registered. We also, I believe, we may have somebody from Tanzania.
Sure. Let us start with Mr. Muksini Mkumba, who is from the External Finance Division of Ministry of Finance in Tanzania. And later on, we'll also go back to an NGO and then come back to the government. So, Mr. Mkumba, you have the floor.
Yeah. Karibu.
So, and you have only 5 minutes, please, for intervention. I'm sorry to say that.
Well, if you can intervene several times. I'd like to also come back to Raj, for example, in the opening. No, I think let's keep this conversational, yeah?
Mr. Mkumba, are you able to unmute yourself?
Thank you very much. And good
if you
morning.
Can also put up your video as well, if you can, of course.
Okay, I'll try a bit. But in my network, I think it's not very good.
We see you fine, actually, sir. You're very clear.
Okay, thank you, Corix, and thank you, Andrew, Ellen, and Honita for setting the scene regarding to this important topic that we have to discuss regarding to the fiscal and monetary challenges that our countries currently are going through. Just to give a perspective of Tanzania regarding to ODA cut, especially to regarding to those big donors, including the USA, France, German, as well as Japan. And that as a Tanzania we have did since receiving those directives on cut on that perspective. So as we all know that this global landscape that's have going through have driven and these geopolitical tensions, including with the technological advancements and climate changes, have been some impact to many of our countries. So like other many countries, the government of Tanzania, following the sum of cuts, has gone and taken the comprehensive assessment, looking on what had been impact of these cuts on economy, on revenue generation, as well as impact to socio-economic activities. And having gone through those assessments, it has been realized that the impact has been mostly on health as a one of the most sector that which is most affected by the ODA cuts. And following that, realizing that the health sector which is being most affected, and this effect is due to that the most of those development partners, they have been channeling the ODA directly to non-government organizations, and instead of channeling them to the government, as has been the case to colleagues from Somalia. And to address this challenge, the government put the correct measures into three categories. That's a short-term, medium-term, and long-term measures. And short-term, the government started to increase the budget to social sectors, including health, education, so that to reduce that over dependence on ODA. And similar to that, the government has took other initiatives, including, and for that immediate has released and over 82 billion Tanzanian shillings, equivalent to USD 34 millions from domestic resources to sustain the essential services and to protect the progress made and ensure that we reduce over reliance on external assistance to those sectors. Also, the government has increased the sector spending, as I've said, from 60.8% of GDP in 2024-2025 to almost 7% of GDP in 2025-2026. And similarly, budget to health sector has been increased to almost 16% in 2025-2026 and allocated nearly to 5.1%. 5.1% of the total budget to health sector. Nearly to this short-term intervention that government has so far undertook, it's also government is investing in domestic industries to ensure that those products that have been being supported by donors that can be produced internally, so that reduce over dependence of those products to be imported from donors. Additional to that, government has amended some laws to establish alternative domestic revenue to support HIV intervention, as I have said that the health sector is one among the most affected sector in the country following the ODA cuts. And in 2025-2026 budget, the government introduced some of the police intervention to ensure that there's at least about 70% of the revenue generated from AIDS trust funds have been allocated to Universal Health Fund to reduce those dependencies from the ODA. On the other hand, the government is intending to increase domestic revenue collection, and in doing so, has currently undertaken several initiatives, including integrating of the tax registration systems, which aims not only to enhance the service delivered to taxpayers, but also reduce administrative bottlenecks and close avenue for linkages and compliances. On the other hand, the government is also introduced a medium-term revenue system, which is a comprehensive multi-year designated to improve revenue collection, enhance policy predictability, and boost public confidence. The strategy itself focuses on closing loophole and reducing the fiscal deficit to achieve a more sustainable and equitable framework to increase domestic revenue at national level, so that those impact of the ODA has not have a direct impact to the development of the country. Similar to these reforms that our country is going through, the number of efforts that ensure that we are broadening our tax base, minimizing the linkages, and improving compliance, so that the government is being able and build a sustainable foundation to finance development priorities with a great reliance on domestic resources. Just to give you a context, as we all know, that ODA, this ODA cut, it has just not only been has not been all effective to the member states, but also it acts as a wake call for us that we have to place a need for homegrown solutions to ensure that we have a long-term economic resilience and financial sustainability for self-reliance instead of depending on the ODA supports. In this regard, we have I think as African countries, and especially to Eastern region, we have everything that we need in our hands. I think we have quite enough natural resources which we can use of them. We have everything that we need, but what is missing is a kind of connection. So we need to have that kind of connection. We have to craft policies and have a good thinking on what can be do to ensure that we change the mindset in policy definitions and tax administration policies to ensure that we are able to collect enough resources to sustain and to finance our economic activities within our countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kumba, for those insights. Could I just ask for the clarification then? So from your comments, it's particularly been the health sector now where there's been the biggest shortfall. Is that correct in the case of Tanzania? Education as well, but particularly health. Would that be correct?
Yes, correct. Health is being one of the most affected sector.
And yet, from what you're saying, the government is making quite a lot of efforts to step into the breach to compensate at least for some of that spending.
Yeah, sure. Intervention are underway, and as I have highlighted earlier, that the government, after having the comprehensive assessment and determined that the health is one among the most affected sector, has started to take the action. And one of the action was the government decided to release around 34 USD millions to health interventions, but also currently under 2025-2026 government budget, the government has introduced tax policies which aims to collect more revenue from domestic resources to finance healthy interventions.
Understood. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for that clarification. Didier, did we have Madam Kadra who would like to speak from Djibouti? Perhaps her next.
Maybe before Madam Kadra, can we first we have Joel, Joel Cheta, who is the CEO. Elle est la directrice de l'agence F4 et administratrice à la Fédération des entreprises du Congo. Joël, vous avez 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît. Et puis, après Joël, il y aura Kedra, il y aura aussi Monsieur Macon, hein, qui est basé au Kenya, mais qui a un think tank de Centrafrique. Si nous pouvons recevoir ces trois, et puis par après, nous allons vers la conclusion.
D'accord.
Madame Joël.
Didier, on doit donner les instructions. For those anglophones in the audience there, the interpretation button is at the bottom. Okay, so you can just click on that and choose the language you wish to hear it in. Okay. Madame Joël?
Oui, bonjour. Voilà, donc vraiment félicitations hein, pour cette belle initiative qui réunit justement beaucoup de monde. Ici, j'interviens en tant que, comme il l'a dit, d'abord en tant que secteur privé, parce que chef d'entreprise, parce que aussi administrateur à la plateforme qui est donc la Fédération des entreprises du Congo, mais j'interviens aussi en tant que présidente d'une ONG, donc il y a aussi la part de la société civile. Et ce que je voudrais relever, vraiment, c'est une phrase que j'ai lue sur une des présentations, The Dramatic Decline of US Assistance. C'est réellement ce que nous, en tant que secteur privé, nous vivons. Donc, rapidement, je voudrais vous dire que, premièrement, on assiste de façon presque systématique à la fermeture et à la stagnation forcée de nombreuses PME et de nombreuses startups. Donc, ces entreprises qui, dans la plupart, bénéficiaient d'environ, d'abord, elles constituent 70% du tissu entrepreneurial congolais, elles dépendaient largement du programme de microcrédit et de subventions financé par les ADP. Deuxièmement, nous avions aussi l'accès au financement qui se complique, donc bien sûr, les coûts pour les produits que mettent à disposition les entrepreneurs deviennent très chers parce que justement l'aide publique nous permettait donc d'avoir une sorte de garantie pour lever des fonds. Aujourd'hui, ce n'est plus possible. Donc, n'ayant plus ces fonds de garantie, bien sûr, ça rend difficile les institutions financières pour pouvoir obtenir des prêts ou pouvoir obtenir même des subventions et ça rend risqué le secteur des secteurs privés. Au niveau des chaînes de valeur locales, là aussi, cette réduction a rendu les choses vraiment dramatiques. Parce que ce soit dans le domaine de l'agro-industrie, que ce soit dans le domaine des mines, les opérateurs économiques, et je parle principalement de la RDC, hein, dépendent des infrastructures clés, qui sont la logistique, l'énergie, et toutes ces maintenances sont faites par les aides publiques ou grâce aux aides publiques. Alors, la dégradation de ces services aujourd'hui augmente les coûts de production et bien entendu, ça réduit la compétitivité et ça met pratiquement toute la population de façon très compliquée. Mais cette coupe a aussi apporté un frein majeur dans les initiatives, on va dire, durables et inclusives. Aujourd'hui, les projets qui sont dédiés à l'économie verte, dédiés à l'entrepreneuriat féminin, à l'entrepreneuriat des jeunes, tous ces projets subissent en ce moment une barrière structurelle à cause justement du fait que nous n'ayons plus cette aide au développement. Donc, on voit que c'est une stagnation qui va créer donc des inégalités incroyables. Mais je voudrais beaucoup plus parler aussi de la société civile. Et ça, vous êtes tous d'accord avec moi, le Congo est un pays, on va dire, en conflit, ou en tout cas face à certaines contraintes. C'est des contraintes de sécurité, c'est des contraintes, j'ai envie de dire, de santé, d'éducation et de tout ce qui s'ensuit derrière. Alors, l'impact de la sur la société civile, ça empêche déjà toutes les ONG d'avoir une capacité d'action et une capacité de plaidoyer. Tout cela est réduit parce qu'elles sont privées en fait de financements internationaux qui leur permettaient de mettre en place des programmes sociaux, des programmes de lutte contre la pauvreté, comme le disait tout à l'heure Madame de Save the Children, des programmes de renforcement de la gouvernance, parce que c'est aussi ça le travail de la société civile. Et tout cela, faute de financement, il y a un affaissement qui se fait au niveau de l'alerte que doit avoir la société civile. Et ça, c'est une question qui est très compliquée. D'autre part, je voudrais parler aussi des programmes sociaux. On l'a dit, éducation, santé, accès à l'eau, tout cela sont malheureusement mis en péril par cette grosse lacune. Alors, pour faire court, j'ai quelques recommandations à faire. Des recommandations qui intègrent tant le secteur privé, qui pour moi fait partie de la société civile, c'est qu'au-delà de tous les tableaux que nous avons épinglés ou dépeints ici, je voudrais que la CEA nous aide à aller un peu plus loin, c'est-à-dire aller dans la stratégie de retournement de situation ou la stratégie de résilience ou de ne pas retomber sur ses pattes. Aujourd'hui, premièrement, ce que je voudrais proposer, c'est que nous revoyions, je dis nous, en fait, que l'UNECA nous aide à revoir de manière concertée les mécanismes de financement en privilégiant d'abord le renforcement des capacités locales et la co-construction des projets. J'en parlais déjà hier, hein, c'est que donner l'opportunité aux acteurs de la société.
Oh, pardon, Madame Joël, on a perdu la connexion, la connectivité. Je pense que Madame Joël était en train de conclure, de finir l'intervention. Didier, I think
Oui,
maybe we could come back
effectivement.
to, yeah, I think maybe we
Euh,
could come back to Madame Joël, okay, and move to another intervention and then come back to her. I think she was just concluding. But her point was well taken about how this is impacting on the private sector in DRC. So, Didier,
exactement, oui. Est-ce que, Madame Kadra Ahmed Saïd, est-ce que vous pouvez, vous êtes capable de parler également? Oui, allez-y, vous pouvez unmute et mettre votre vidéo et puis donner votre contribution, Madame.
Oui, bonjour tout le monde.
Bonjour.
bonjour Madame Kadra.
Bonjour Monsieur André, bonjour l'équipe de la CEA. Excusez-moi Monsieur Dédé, je n'arrive pas à activer la cam parce qu'il ne me donne pas cette option d'activer la cam.
Ok, il n'y a pas de souci, on vous écoute. Allez-y.
D'accord.
Oui.
Merci pour la présentation qui était très enrichissante et importante. Juste, je vais un peu résumer de l'aide et l'impact américain sur l'économie de Djibouti. Et depuis janvier 2025, les États-Unis ont lancé une révélation d'aide étrangère, un gel de la plupart des financements UACD pendant 90 jours ou prolongés, et des coupures budgétaires importantes prévues dans le programme de développement, d'éducation, de gouvernance, de la santé. À Djibouti, il y a des stocks alimentaires humanitaires, des stocks alimentaires humanitaires financés par la USAID sont actuellement bloqués dans les entrepôts du port, risquant de se gâter faute de distribution, ce qui menace la sécurité alimentaire des milliers de réfugiés à Djibouti et communautés vulnérables, et la communauté bien évidemment vulnérable. Les projets de développement énergie solaire hors appui, pour ce qui est des projets de développement, il y a l'énergie solaire hors réseau, appui aux associations locales, renforcement de capacité, etc., sont incertains pour l'instant. Ils risquent d'être suspendus ou annulés si les financements ne sont pas débloqués. Les ONG également locales et partenaires qui dépendent de ces fonds voient leur capacité affaiblie, ce qui peut ralentir la mise en œuvre des programmes sociaux. Donc, en conséquence, à court terme, pour Djibouti, risque de rupture d'assistance alimentaire, fragilisant des programmes de santé et d'éducation non considérés. Et à moyen terme, on peut dire peut-être incertitude budgétaire pour l'État. Bon, ça reste qu'une une estimation. Donc, ici, j'ai une petite question ou suggestion par rapport à ça. Dans le cas où Djibouti, dont l'économie est fortement exposée au choc externe, donc on avait vu tout à l'heure Madame Elena présenter, où une partie de la population dépend directement de l'assistance humanitaire, ça serait utile que la CEA, en coordination avec les partenaires régionaux, explore des pistes, par exemple faciliter une diversification des financements vers d'autres bailleurs actifs de la région, accompagner par exemple, le gouvernement dans le renforcement des capacités nationales pour mobiliser davantage de ressources domestiques et régionales. Voilà à peu près ce que je voulais intervenir par rapport à ça. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Cadre. Je pense que c'est important. Personne n'a parlé de cette situation de la sécurité alimentaire et la situation avec les réfugiés. Non? Donc, effectivement, dans toutes les régions, tous les programmes d'assistance pour les réfugiés sont très dépendants de l'assistance extérieure. Et on avoue que c'était très mal affecté par la réduction des aides. Donc, oui, merci pour cette contribution. Didier?
Oui, merci beaucoup. Bon, il nous reste environ 15 minutes, si vous permettez que nous puissions avoir deux interventions. Et puis par après, nous allons vers la conclusion. Et vraiment, tenez vos contributions si brèves pour que nous puissions nous tous participer. Donc, j'aimerais demander à Monsieur Macon Mambeba Richard, euh, si vous pouvez intervenir, s'il vous plaît. You have the floor. Vous pouvez mettre la vidéo et également unmute yourself.
Merci beaucoup. Nous n'avons pas l'option vidéo. Merci beaucoup pour cette occasion de discussion que la CEA nous offre ce matin. Moi, je voudrais d'abord vous féliciter pour le courage que vous avez de soulever ce type de problématiques qui sont des problématiques centrales. Depuis hier, nous assistons à des travaux de très haut niveau et l'expertise de la CEA et la qualité des travaux que vous livrez sont respectables. Le sérieux que vous mettez dans la collecte des données de terrain informe les politiques, nous donne des éléments pour mieux comprendre la configuration économique du continent et les spécificités de chaque environnement. Donc, félicitations à vous. Alors, je voulais dire que nous savons tous que la fin de l'aide publique au développement est inévitable. Il y a une pluralité de travaux, de doctrines et même des agences des Nations Unies qui annonçaient la fin de l'aide publique au développement. Donc, nous ne sommes pas surpris par ce qui est en train d'arriver. Je crois que l'objectif aujourd'hui, c'est de se préparer à la fin de l'aide publique au développement. Moi, je suis coordonnateur régional en Afrique centrale et en Afrique de l'Est pour la Fondation de l'innovation pour la démocratie. Et je vis à Nairobi une bonne partie de l'année et on voit la situation économique du pays se détériorer. L'Afrique de l'Est a l'avantage que, étant une grande partie anglophone, elle bénéficie beaucoup des financements venant des États-Unis, venant de la Grande-Bretagne. Et la disparition de l'USAID et des financements américains a plongé le pays sérieusement en crise. Aujourd'hui, les organismes, non seulement publics, privés qui bénéficiaient des financements, et les ONG qui travaillaient dans le champ de l'économie, de l'inclusion économique et de l'environnement sont aujourd'hui en train de fermer. Sur 10 organisations avec lesquelles on travaillait, au moins la moitié ont fermé et les organisations qui restent ont diminué de plus de 70% leur personnel. Ça concerne aussi les ambassades américaines elles-mêmes qui, aujourd'hui, pour beaucoup, ont fait disparaître une bonne partie de leur personnel et le pays opte pour le système de la représentation multiple en mutualisant certains bureaux. Et donc, c'est une crise qui est générale, qui nous affecte de façon considérable. Et les financements, l'aide publique au développement touchait surtout le secteur rural. Vous savez que 75% des Kenyans vivent en zone rurale. Et donc, l'aide publique bénéficiait beaucoup à la ruralité, tant dans les questions d'éducation, de santé, de lutte contre la déforestation et d'autres fléaux. Et donc, je pense qu'aujourd'hui, la CEA doit davantage réfléchir sur la question et créer des espaces de discussion afin que nous trouvions des solutions propres au continent. Je pense que la réflexion aujourd'hui qui doit nous mobiliser, c'est comment trouver des alternatives à l'aide publique au développement. parce que la situation ne va pas changer. Elle va changer peut-être en pire. Quand on regarde même aujourd'hui les Nations Unies eux-mêmes, avec la diminution des budgets, il faut trouver des solutions aujourd'hui qui soient propres au continent. Je voudrais en proposer quelques-unes. La première, on est davantage revenu abondamment sur la mobilisation de l'épargne nationale. On voit comment le Sénégal est en train de lancer un emprunt en ce moment en mobilisant sa diaspora. La plupart des pays africains travaillent à des emprunts obligataires, à la mobilisation de l'épargne nationale. Il me semble que ça, c'est une des clés de la sortie de la dépendance de l'aide publique au développement. L'autre chose, c'est l'amélioration des régimes fiscaux et l'amélioration de la capacité de recouvrement de l'impôt dans la plupart des pays qui sont concernés. Il a été démontré que 30 à 40% des impôts ne sont pas recouvrés. Les États ont de sérieuses difficultés dans le recouvrement de leurs impôts. Même lorsque des impôts existent, la capacité des gouvernements à recouvrer totalement les impôts est extrêmement faible dans la plupart des pays, non seulement de l'Afrique de l'Est, encore pire en Afrique centrale. Donc, il faut travailler à l'amélioration de ces régimes fiscaux et à l'amélioration des capacités des États à recouvrer l'impôt, mais en tenant compte effectivement des exigences communautaires. La troisième solution serait l'amélioration du financement privé. Ces fameux financements innovants, il faut miser sur ces financements innovants qui me semblent être des solutions à long terme solides. On a abondamment abordé aussi la question de l'investissement direct étranger, mais qui est très dépendant de la qualité de la sécurité juridique et judiciaire des pays d'accueil. L'autre élément serait le renforcement de la coopération technique. On sait très bien que l'apport des financements peut diminuer, mais nous pouvons inciter les partenaires à miser davantage sur la coopération technique, le transfert des compétences, le transfert des technologies qui permet d'apporter des aides extrêmement importantes aux États sans que celles-ci ne soient financières exclusivement. Il y a aussi l'exploitation évidemment intelligente, durable et soutenable des ressources naturelles, l'innovation et l'entrepreneuriat local qui doivent être renforcés et le développement du COMEX. On a abondamment discuté de la question du COMEX. Ça, c'est une solution importante sur laquelle il faut miser et la CEA a les compétences, l'expertise pour continuer à aider davantage les États africains et la région en général sur l'amélioration du commerce qui est une solution. On parle de coopération sud-sud, on parle du commerce sud-sud. C'est une solution à cette diminution de l'aide publique au développement et la CEA fait déjà un travail formidable. Il faut l'encourager à rester dans cette perspective et aller au-delà. Et donc, des espaces de discussion comme ceux-ci qui permettent de réfléchir aux solutions, aux alternatives de l'aide publique doivent être renforcés. Merci beaucoup pour cette opportunité de discussion et je vous remercie pour le travail que vous faites.
Thank you very much, Macron, for those insights. J'avais compris que vous parlez de Nairobi, c'est ça?
Oui.
Tout à fait, oui, d'accord. I think that would be an opportune moment if we have a couple of representatives, I believe, from the State Department of Economic Planning in Kenya.
Ouais.
Could we maybe perhaps invite Judith Onyango to say a word?
Thank you. My name is Judith Onyango. I've already given my recommendation in the chat.
Yes, we saw. It's probably better to say it to yourself, you know. We'd like to hear from you in person.
Yeah, I like the presentation, and you're speaking to Kenya as a low middle income country. I know we are at risk of debt distress, considering we have limited access to grants and concessional finance. But I agree with one of the recommendations to reconsider sustainable solutions. And as a country, we are committed to strengthen domestic resource mobilization. It seems it's key in financing development. So I agree we could adopt other alternative methods like PPP, also diaspora bonds, and speaking to what we're already implementing as a country. Thank you.
So if I may come back on that, Judith, so I've seen that remittance growth, for example, has been very healthy for Kenya in the past couple of years. It's been quite buoyant. But in terms of raising domestic revenue further, clearly the government's had some challenges, hasn't it? So I was wondering about the extent to which it's realistic when we talk about domestic resource mobilization for member states in difficult situation, but also communities, as we were hearing from the last interventions, which are also struggling. So raising more domestic revenues and taxes is quite challenging, is it not? So I do wonder, what are the genuine opportunities there to really leverage more tax resources?
Thank you. What I can comment is that right now we have a medium-term revenue strategy with specific options that are available for us. So it's progressive. We assess what is working and what is not working. We're going to see how we can improve. I think I can only comment to that much for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Judith. Didier?
Yes, thank you very much. As we are wrapping up, let me ask, Gilbert has been insisting, I think he wants to say something, Gilbert Ehewem, as well as also Raj wanted to come back. So can I give you 3 minutes each? 3 minutes, I'll be timing it. 3 minutes each. Gilbert?
2.5 minutes, I think, Didier. We've got 5 minutes left.
Yes.
Yeah,
so
okay, it'd be good to come back to Raj. Yeah, at the end.
Yeah, let's start with Gilbert. Gilbert, now you're promoted. When you're promoted, you can unmute and then I think put up your video if you can. So Gilbert, you have the floor. You have 2 minutes, and then we'll ask also Mr. Raj, and then the director will do the concluding remarks. Thank you very much.
And please introduce yourself as well, Gilbert.
Thank you so much, Didier. Thank you so much, Andrew. My name is Gilbert Eweme, presently in Cameroon. I run a Pan-African organization called Accelerate Africa, and we work in 10 countries in Africa, and we work closely in Central Africa and East Africa. So we do a lot of work in supporting SMEs and startup founders across the continent. And personally, I've been doing quite a lot with the ECA, both in East Africa and Central Africa. And I understand that the ECA has done a lot of research work, published a lot of documentation on investment, innovative financing, and so on. But however, the challenge is still very, very enormous because most of this research work stay in paper. The implementation is quite challenging. A very quick question for the ECA. How do we translate all this research work, your presentation, your booklet, and so on, to practical, concrete actions that will benefit startups and SMEs across the continent? We all know they are the private sector. They are close to 90%. The middle of the African economy. But the key challenge they face is investment, financing. How do we solve that? One of the key challenges that we face is innovative financing, which in the meeting they joined ICE yesterday, Jean-Luc as well mentioned. And this is one of the key things that the ECA has been talking about. But concretely, what is happening? What is the impact? What is the result? Innovative financing for SMEs is key. I'll take a concrete example. We are developing a program, an accelerated stock program, where we want to launch in 10 African countries, and we'll be hosting the program in Rwanda, in Kigali, in February. And we are launching a crowdfunding campaign. That's innovative financing. But unfortunately, we can't host a crowdfunding campaign in Africa. What is the problem? How do we solve that? We need to find someone, a partner in America, in UK, in Europe, who can host a crowdfunding campaign. So I think innovative financing is one of the key important instruments that we can bridge the financing gap for SMEs and startups across Africa. So the ECA really need to look into that. My second worry is at the level of the donor.
Sorry. Sorry to interrupt, but we do have a limited time and we wish to give a last speaker. Can you say the last point in just a couple of sentences, possibly?
Okay, that's fine. My last point will just focus on the donations, donors, and so on. How can ECA influence African government to move away from donations? Mindful, the African Union, 70% of their donations come from abroad. How do we solve that? We need to start changing the narrative and mobilize more internal resources for Africa, in Africa. Thank you.
Gilbert, you raised some very big questions there, which I'm afraid in the 1 minute that's remaining, we would not have time to deal with, but they are very important and crucial issues. It's about changing the narrative to your second question there, and that's where ECA has its strengths. You know, we're an intergovernmental organization that deals with all the African member states. So that's an important part. On your first question about the SMEs, there's a lot of complicated questions there about why the domestic financial systems are not really serving the interests of the private sector properly. But it would take us rather a while to go into that. I'd be happy to exchange with you bilaterally on the topic, especially if you're based here in Kigali. Okay. Raj, I believe you wish to come back in. As you started off the comments, it would be very good to hear back from you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Online.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll try to be brief. I don't have this reputation of being brief. First, I would make, in terms of priorities, some suggestions. First, I'm going directly to suggestions. First, I would invite UNECA to establish an ODA observatory, because I believe that ODA will not end now. And on the other hand, the beneficiary countries, those which need very much, those NGOs which need it very much, they will be with time in a more vulnerable situation. That's first. Secondly, I would suggest also UNECA to approach ADB to establish a technical assistance for formulating credible and bankable projects, including for SMEs. Because I believe, and this is where I've seen in my whole career, that, you know, there are some NGOs, international and the others, including international institutions, which develop many projects. They are very good in attracting resources, but not necessarily achieving the objectives for which they are set. So please, if UNECA can approach ADB to establish a technical assistant to support countries and NGOs and SMEs to develop projects. Now, there are a few issues that I would like to mention if I have time. First, I believe that there are many NGOs in many countries which do a very good job, but they are not liked very much by the governments. And I think in the observatory, if UNECA will establish, it will be very important to try to, you know, really distinguish between those which do very good work. In Mauritius, for example, a small country with 1.2 million people, 1.28, there are several dozens of thousands of NGOs. And I think it's everywhere is the same. So we need to really identify those which are good and those which really need to be supported. My other point is about the youth. We should have a specific component on the youth and how we can support the youth organizations on this. My third comment on this is that the island states, they have not developed any strategies to deal with the declining ODAs. And I think this is where they need to be supported. How? I would again invite UNECA and to call upon ADB and to look at that, and those countries which are ready to then provide them support. My other point is that it is very important that the you know, it was mentioned by one of the, that alternative and innovative financing, including reforms of the whole financial system and mechanisms to be put in place, because currently my observation is that all the countries in the region, developing countries, their whole financing mechanisms are obsolete. So we need to see how we can develop these, and again, those countries which are ready to, we can get the ADB to provide support to review, understand, and work with the countries how to. And then my very last point is ADB should look at the islands. For the right now, IOC has no projects for the last 10 years with ADB. So I presume, I'm sorry to say it that way, but I think that ADB is not looking at the islands properly. For example, if you look at the SIDS, you know, for example, we say, okay, 100 billion for climate change, blah, blah, blah. But what part is for the SIDS, knowing very well that the SIDS have much difficulty in accessing funding. So I stop here because of limitation of time. I would have gone on specifics for the IOC or the REX, but there is no time, so let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Raj. I think we could come back on that specificities for the IOC because we will be providing some support for IOC later this year. So yeah, thank you very much. I think you summarized actually some of the topics very, very well. You did you did our job for us. Thank you. So Didier, is there any closing remarks or comments from the floor before we close?
Only to ladies and gentlemen to thank you very much. So as we are wrapping up this timely discussion on the effects of ODA cutbacks in Eastern Africa. So we would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to all our participants and all our interpreters, the technicians, of course, the presenters. So all the officials from the government, from REX, from private sector, from civil society, we thank you very much. So I would like to ask Andrew Mould, maybe one final note before we wrap up, and
Well,
also
yes,
invite also others for tomorrow's discussion as well. Thank you.
Yes, just to reiterate those thanks to all the government officials, civil society representatives, private sector representatives, and others here present for your attention, for participating. It's been an interesting discussion. Thanks also for my colleagues, Anita and Elena, for preparing the background documentation, and all the other colleagues that have supported this event. So yes, just one final reminder then. Tomorrow we will be holding a session at the same time from 10 to 12 Central African time, where we will be discussing the impact of the disruption to global trading system by the US tariffs. And we will provide some numbers and statistics actually on the evaluation on how that is currently impacting the region. And our results are somewhat surprising. So I think that people present here may find that session also very interesting. So thank you once again, and look forward to seeing some of you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. So have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.